Okay, welcome. It's great to see you. I love to tell the MAF story. I've told it hundreds of times, maybe thousands, I wouldn't know. Could be million. But I never get tired of telling it, because I always get excited as I think all God has done over these nearly 70 years with MAF. It's amazing to me. And the MAF story, yes, but it is God's story. And that's the whole thing about it. Psalm 145 says, I will praise you every day. This is something we all should be doing as God's children, isn't it? And tell about the amazing things you do, and here's the kind of punchline there, and overflow with your great goodness. That's terrific. It's a wonderful verse to start each day with almost, isn't it? And I love Psalm 40, because this relates so much to how I see the MAF story, how I've seen it. The things you planned for us, no one can recount. Many, O Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, too many to declare. And in this short time, I'm only going to be able to touch on a few major highlights of the story. The whole story is told in the various versions of MAF. Hope Has Wings in English, in Verhaal van Hoop in Dutch, and whatever it says in German. So, and if you haven't read that, I hope what I say will incentivize you to read it, because there's so much detail and so many occasions where we've seen God at work and really perform miracles amazingly. So, the things you planned for us, no one can recount. Yes, well, what was the plan? What were the beginnings? Well, just after World War II, as the war was finishing, a few of us who were in different air forces in the world were drawn together into national groups. None of us knew about each other at that time. The Americans were well away in this, and so were we here in UK. In South Africa, a South African Air Force pilot was already concerned with exactly the same thought, that we could use small planes to reach into small and distant, neglected places to share the love of God. That the tools we'd seen used so effectively and devastatingly in the years of the war could be used for the gospel of peace and of hope and love. So that was the plan God put into our hearts. Different places all over the world at the same time, without us knowing about each other at the beginning. This to me is the amazing part of the story. God said, this is the time I'm going to take this tool that has been used so effectively in destruction and make it my tool and use it for the gospel of peace. That's exciting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So, what about the beginnings? And I'm talking particularly about the beginnings here in Europe. As I say, the plan started at the end of World War II. There was a pilot called Murray Kendon, who was a New Zealand pilot, flying with the Royal Air Force Coastal Command in Scotland, who first came up with the name MAF, which was later adopted by all the MAF groups. There's Murray and his wife, Minnie. She is a bit small. He had led her to the Lord, by the way, while they were both in the Air Force. And Murray's plan was that planes would be used, as I say, small planes reaching into small, distant, remote and difficult to reach places, but they would be used professionally, because there had been a lot of tragedies after the war. Missionaries are enterprising people. At first, like David Livingstone, they used to walk and walk and walk for years at a time sometimes. Then the bicycle came, so of course they went on the bicycle. And of course there was the donkey and the mule. I've ridden the mule, wonderful animal to ride, especially when he kicks all his load off. And then the car came, of course they started using that. And the light aeroplane, and enthusiastic pioneer missionaries were using that. But there were, I think, something like 9 fatalities after World War II of missionaries attempting to use a tool when they'd only had private pilot's licenses, no maintenance experience and so on, and that was sad. So Murray's plan and thought, and the idea that was also in the mind of the other groups, as we all found out as we got together, was very similar. So Murray called it MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship, and others of us joined Murray here in UK at that time. Murray is there right on the right hand side. Jack Hemmings here was a squadron leader in the Air Force in India and Burma. He got the Air Force Cross for his flying there. I'm next to him. Ken Ellis in the middle was a temporary helper. Tom Banham next was a Fleet Air Arm navigator. Important man. We were looking forward to having all his skills on the flying and surveying we were about to do. And there's Murray Kendall. Africa was chosen for us coming from UK. We discussed it quite a lot with American MAF. They were already starting in Mexico and South America. We were going to do a combined survey of the whole of East, Central and Western Africa originally, but they were so occupied that it was agreed we would press ahead. We needed a plane for this. We tried other methods, and our council decided we needed an aeroplane to actually go out and see for ourselves the conditions, the requirements of governments, everything that might be involved in setting up an aviation service in very remote areas. It took us 2 years to get our first plane. MAF was a very new organisation. It was not that well known at the beginning. Things are improving now. And but finally we had a plane, and the plane chosen was the Miles Gemini. It was a new plane. It was a timber aircraft, wood aircraft, a twin-engine aircraft with retractable undercarriage, and a very nice little plane, 4-seat. It had one deficiency that we really kind of found out later. It had been designed during the end of the war, and the engines for which it was designed were not actually available due to such short supply. So the engines it had were both about 30% less power than that for which it was designed. That was quite interesting, as you'll find out later. We flew it around UK to demonstrate it to people who were interested, who had been praying for the work, and because we wanted to find out as much as possible about the plane, to get used to it before we took it to some of the remotest areas in Africa. We wanted to find out all we might need, the spares we might need, and anything else we might need to know about the aircraft and its operation. So we flew it to the north, the south, the east and the west of the UK, and even went to Dublin in Ireland. So after that then, we were getting ready for the survey. We actually were ready to take off on January the 13th, 1948, a day I will never forget. Here we are at the old airport, long before Heathrow came, in London, Croydon Airport, the source of many epic pioneer flights in the past. The airport tower is still there, but the airport is now closed. We were there, as you can see, on a wet and windy day. You couldn't have had a worse day to start flying on a survey flight. However, that's where we were. We loaded the plane up. We had to be very careful, as always, in weighing all that went in. And we already knew that with the amount of spares we were going to need so that we could service the plane in places in the bush where there was no facilities, that we would need a lot of spares. Now that meant two things. One, we were going to have to cut back on fuel load, which meant we would have very short hops. We could only go about 400 miles or 650 kilometers at a time, and that was going to make it a long, slow journey. And secondly, and interestingly, we'd have to dispense with our navigator. There was no room or wait for Tom Banham. He went out by boat, and that was good though, actually, because he got out to Nairobi and was organising everything for our survey. So Jack Hemmings and I were left with the task of flying that plane out and flying it on its survey. The plane was called a Gemini. You all know, I'm sure, that the Gemini constellation consists of two stars, Castor and Pollux. And so Jack and I soon got called the Heavenly Twins. I don't know that we ever lived up to that high calling. Yes, so a full load and very short hops. And it took us a long time. Again, you will read it in the book. Some fascinating things happened on that journey out. Here we are, quite some weeks into our travel to Nairobi, to Kenya, where we started on the border between Sudan and Eritrea, refueling, typical kind of refueling from 4-gallon petrol cans en route. Yeah, that was Shell Aviation's high-class provision in those days. A month later, this was supposed to be a 9-month survey, by the way. We had 100 mission stations we were going to visit throughout Eastern, Central and Western Africa. A month later we were in the center of Congo at a place where they had never seen an airplane before. As for those two dashing white men, I don't know about that. But 3 chiefs there are there. They were the important people. People had walked for 3 days to come and see this plane. The doctor who wanted us to go there had pulled out 1,000 trees to build this airstrip and finally told us it was ready. We flew in, we came right in over this place. Our navigation was really remarkable, you've got to admit that. And the villagers there, this place Bulape in central Congo, said, "How did you know where we lived?" So they were astounded. And while we were walking around, we found people following us and watching. There were young boys there looking for wings on our back, but they weren't there, of course. The chiefs all had, each of those 3 chiefs had 30 wives. And they wanted to know how many wives we had, because we must be important people if we had an airplane. And we were both bachelors then, so we really disappointed them. Yes, there was no GPS or sat-navs in those days, and the maps were far from accurate. Some of them were dangerously inaccurate. We used to send reports every week back to our office in London saying what was happening, going on. And I used to illustrate them almost always. And here's one of the pictures I wrote demonstrating That's we're in Zori, by the way, for those of you who know Eastern Congo, glowering at us. Sometimes we didn't quite know just where we were. Numbers of MAF pilots have experienced that since, as you know well enough. I drew another, this was pioneer work, remember, and I wanted to demonstrate, and this is the next cartoon I drew, was right at the beginning of our survey, and you know, we were really breaking new ground in mountainous country, so that was another picture. But yes, unfortunately, that proved to be prophetic. I don't advise trying to take the top off a mountain in a light aeroplane. It just doesn't work. So don't try it. We were caught in our underpowered plane in the mountains of Burundi in severe downdrafts with full throttle. We were going down at 300 feet a minute. What's that in kilometers? Probably about 450 or something. And there was no way we could climb out of the valleys up which we just closed. The full story is in the book. You have to read it if you haven't. And so we had a lot to learn. And MAF has learnt a lot about flying techniques over the years. What it means to fly in countries where the temperatures are, as we say, hot, high and humid, which reduces the performance of your plane, the power of the engine, the thrust of the propellers and everything. We had been used in the Air Force of flying high-powered planes where you had all the power at your elbow that you might ever want. And here we were with very different equipment. So how do you think we felt as we looked at all that we'd planned for, all that we felt God had led us for 2.5 years, reduced to matchwood? What would you have said? I mean, I think I did say, Lord, I don't think this is so. I don't think you've led us up the garden path. But, and amazingly, you know, God gives you, He doesn't give you grace about tragedies before they happen. But I do believe that when they happen, He gives you the grace to carry on. And we carried on. We carried on with this was 6 months into our 9-month survey. The last 3 months we used a Ford pickup and drove around the areas that we still needed to reach. Yes. After that we returned to England, and by the grace of God we got the insurance money on our wrecked Gemini. That was a little bit of a miracle too. And were able to buy another plane. During our survey of the whole of that area, one country had stood out above all others as having the greatest need. You might have thought, well, Congo is a country of great need. In those days, with the Belgians there were very good roads all over the place, and missionaries would say to us, I don't need an airplane, I can drive 70 miles an hour anywhere I want to go, and I've got my car at the end with me. But of course, since then, as you know, since independence and the Belgians left, the country deteriorated, unfortunately, and was losing 2,000, I think it was 2,000 miles or kilometers a year into the jungle. And so the situation is totally different now. But the Sudan, the vast area, especially of the swamps in the south, where missionaries had died because they couldn't get out. And in some cases, children, missionary kids had died because they couldn't be helped, that medicine couldn't be flown to them, they couldn't be taken out. That was the area of need. So it's the Sudan we went, and the Sudan government, because of the desolate nature of the terrain, they'd lost aircraft and had to put out searches costing millions, insisted that we had a twin-engine plane. The only one we could afford at that stage was what I call the elegant antique, the de Havilland Rapide. They've been used all over the world. But this was an Air Force, ex-Air Force One, been used for radio training during the war. And that is what we bought and prepared to go out to start service in the Sudan. In the picture there, you can see Jack Hemmings and myself. Jack was married there, and that's Helen, his wife. And we three went out in 1950 to the Sudan with the plane. And having set up a service, that's another story, see the book, the plane soon became an invaluable tool to the missionaries. It was amazing how much it was in use wherever we went. There we are, rushing around, getting it ready to take off in South Sudan. First landings are always exciting. Any of you have been involved in flying in Africa or in other parts of the world will know that. This was our first landing amongst the Maban tribe in southern Sudan. They had never seen an airplane before. They'd seen little dots flying in the sky, going over commercial planes, and they couldn't understand how they were supposed to have people in them. They were so small. So when we came down, and again the missionary here had pulled out nearly 1,000 trees for this, they were so excited. They thronged around the plane, wanting to touch it and touching it, I'm afraid, quite a lot. You know, how was it made? How did it work? We went into one remote tribe, and they insisted they had invented this. So I thought they might have come up with a better design, but that was their story. But sometimes first landings can be too exciting. Oops. This was at a remote swampy airstrip in the same area. The South Sudan is, most of the soil is cotton soil, gumbo soil, which in the dry season is very hard and cracks, and in the wet season it seems to be a bottomless pit of mud. And this was a new airstrip at a remote place in the Dinka Plain where we were attempting to take off. We had landed successfully, but as we took off, the wheels sunk into the soft soil, and that's what happened. So what do you do with a plane like that when you've kind of rather messed it up? Well, I had the job of repairing it. All the controls ran forward into the nose and backwards to the wings and the tail. All the pilot controls were in the nose, which was completely smashed in. It was timber, as I say. So it was quite a job. And it was the beginning of the rainy season. In 6 months' time, if we got caught in the rains before we had it repaired and flown out, we would have been trapped there for 6 months. And that wasn't the plan at all. So I had the job of repairing it, and then the pilot who was with us, Steve Stevens, some of you know, went off on foot, trekking across the swamp to the Nile to try to arrange for some spare propellers. It took me 18 days to repair the plane. The missionary in charge said, "Stuart, anything you want, anything you need, help yourself." So I found all the missionaries' packing cases, big plywood containers. They brought their supplies into this remote area, because you had to bring in 6 months' supplies at least, and use the timber from that. A lot of it was quite good. I went round the missionaries' furniture and took screws out of the chairs, as many screws as I dare, without completely causing collapse if someone sat on it, and finally got it done. I think we used a Pyrex mixing bowl from one of the ladies to replace the lamp cover of the landing light in the nose. But yes, it wasn't all disaster. There was some delight from the disaster. The missionary had said, anything you need, Stuart, you can take. So I took one of the lady missionaries. And 9 months later, we were married in Khartoum. And Phyllis, my wife, became very much part of the work. I always say I married her because she had had a lot of good business training, and I desperately needed a secretary and someone to look after the accounts. That she had brown eyes, the colour of tea, which I love, and she had sexy ankles. so things weren't easy, and Phyllis soon found that out. She was keeping the accounts, as I say. That was a great relief for a few other of us in the work. And she used to keep the books there in the heat of the Sudan. Our first plane, that wooden Rapide, had had all these months by then. This was a year after we'd been out there, and it was due for its overhaul. It had had a wet season and a dry season, and it was a timber plane, and we decided it just had to be stripped right down. We were going to have to go right down, recover. It was fabric covered. Oh yes, I must say that in God's grace, although we had no finance from UK at that time, everyone who'd started in the work had disappeared. Murray Kendon had gone back to New Zealand, and a few others involved. Well, I think we had one person around, but there was nothing. We weren't getting any. Can you imagine running an air service, even a small one with one plane? I don't know, and even Phyllis didn't know, how we survived, but we did. Sometimes missionaries who knew nothing of our financial situation, they just loved our service, would give us gifts, and one way and another God supplied. You know, it is amazing what God does when, humanly speaking, you can hardly believe it. But here's the stripped down plane. One of the engineers in Sudan Airways went through and said that looks more like a boat than a plane, and we could agree with him. And after we worked on that for quite a few months, and we had a lot of trouble getting replacement supplies that we needed, we found that the spars in the main lower wing were quite badly split. That plane never flew again. So here we were once more, back to zero. What do you do? If you want to know the story of how we got a replacement Rapide, the best one we've ever had, you've got to read the book. After 7 years of operating in the Sudan, with the Rapides, with no hangar, with no radio connection to the mission stations to which we were flying, we'd have to fly in, as it were, blind as far as information was concerned. And sometimes when the weather was bad, it was fairly blind with the weather too, not knowing what condition the probably swampy strips would be in when we got there. We had no permission for that. We also had to do all our communications. There was no radio telephone. All our long distance communications were in Morse, by the way. I had to get a international Morse operator's license, the first the Sudan authorities had ever issued, by the way. So I still have that. What a classic. But after 7 years, the authorities were so confident in our operation, praise God, we hadn't crashed too many planes, that they said we could start to operate single-engine planes. And that was a relief, because we could turn our eyes to the all-metal single-engine Cessnas that were available and used in other areas. So this was the first one we had out there in the Sudan. The story of how it got there is another story with lots of things in it. You'd be amazed. And I'm there with Ernie Krenzen, who was an American MAF pilot who came to work with us at that time. We were also, it took us quite a long time to get that first plane again. Phyllis and I were raising funds. We went home on our furlough, and you know, they work you when you go on home assignment. We're raising funds both in UK and in the States, actually. Anyway, we got it after 2 years, but we got a second one, as you see there. The first one took 2 years to get. The second one came in a single phone call from the States, where a businessman phoned me up and said, we have a Cessna we'd like to give you. Are you interested? So I asked him for the specification, and he gave me, I said, yes. It was a second-hand one, but Charlie Mellis of MAF US said, oh, we can sell that, and because of the discount we get at this time with Cessna, get you a new one. So we really appreciated all the help we had in that. And you notice we've got a marvellous hangar. It's well ventilated, but to us that was fabulous. It was a delight. It was an old Air Force blister hangar. So after 7 years, things changed. And once again, our planes continued to be very busy throughout the South Sudan, non-stop flying. Here we are back in that area near Doro, where we showed you the pictures of those first landing. We not only flew a land plane, because of the wet season the airstrips would get so very swamped, we decided that we would put floats on one of our 2 planes. That meant it could go along all the rivers and tributaries, and we actually had more landing places in the wet season than we did in the dry. So there we are, and there in that plane is Betty Green, who's one of the pioneers and founders of American MAF, who was with us for 2 years, one of the best pilots I have ever flown with, and a lovely lady too, and we were so glad for her being with us for that time. At this stage we decided we should be thinking about Ethiopia. We were already beginning to fly across the border of Sudan into Ethiopia. We'd amazingly got permission to do that, and operating into Western Ethiopia. And so we planned on, in 1958, for a proper survey. And as we went there, we saw what a rugged country it was, vast chasms and mountains, a very challenging country, very difficult for travel. Again, there were, especially in the southwest, there were rivers and endless rainforests. Here we are crossing one of the rivers during our survey. This is the river Dabus. This is the dry season, by the way. Any other season you couldn't cross it, but it was just shallow enough that you could get across. I had to walk across in front to find a shallow pathway for the 2 jeeps following. That was quite interesting, especially as there were crocodiles around, but one of the missionaries behind me had a shotgun. So it was good. I think the crocodiles respected that. We, let's say, used a float plane into the borders of Ethiopia, but most of our work was on mountain airstrips, and many of them sloping airstrips with all their difficulties and interests. But we found that we could set up an operation. We built a base in southwest Ethiopia. Every area where MAF works, we aim to have a good maintenance base to support the work. And this was ours in there. during our time in Ethiopia, we were operating up to 7 aircraft, by the way, eventually, from 2 bases. From there we expanded into other countries: Tanzania, Chad, Uganda, Kenya, Madagascar, Mongolia, and so on. And as you know, MAF globally, worldwide, between all our groups, now covers a tremendous area. And this is terrific. I mean, globally, with MAF from Europe, MAF International, MAF USA, MAF Australia, and some of the national MAF groups, God has widened the territory where we were. So we're now in 25 countries. We have over 1,400 partners. This is interesting. When we started, the missionary was the development agency, the person who would go in and start. In our early days, they did agricultural work, they did the education, everything that development agencies and NGOs of today were, they did. But more and more, we expanded to other partners. We fly for Oxfam, World Vision, and so on. The list is endless, as you can see. And we fly to more destinations than any other airline. I think the statistics is we fly to more places than the first 10 airlines put together. So this is what God has done. Here we are, we started with nothing. All of our groups, at the very beginning years between us, we had 2 or 3 planes. We all had accidents and crashes. The Australians lost their first pilot in New Guinea. But from that, this has grown, and it just amazes me. Yes, we now have 135 small aeroplanes. There I am with the Kodiak, familiar to some of you. This is when it came through England on its way out to Kalimantan. And we have such nice hangars now. It's, we're really spoiled, but everything is much more sophisticated. We were early pioneers, amateurs in some things, though hopefully professionals at aviation. But now the work has developed so much. And all the clever people we now have in MAF is amazing. But some things haven't changed. Try as we might, we have not been able to improve the tropical weather. It always seems to be the same. And whether it's in Sudan or Papua New Guinea or in the Congo, DRC, or everywhere, this is one of the things our pilots still have to face. And airstrips are very often a challenge. Sloping, wet, difficult conditions. But above all, our call has never changed. And I'm so thankful for that. So many organizations lose their original vision and get carried away. And MAF could have easily be sidelined into concentrating on a lot of commercial work and so on. There are many things, but our call has not changed. And so I go back to where we began. The things you planned for us. What's He planned for you? He has plans for all of us. Many, O Lord my God, are wonders you have done, are too many to declare. So I will praise you every day and tell about the amazing things you do and overflow with your great goodness. Challenge to us all.